The gun was already drawn when Violet Hale walked into the Lucky Spur Saloon, and it was pointed directly at the man everyone in Redemption Creek called the most dangerous outlaw this side of the Rio Grande. She had not come here looking for trouble. She had come here looking for answers about her father's stolen land, her stolen life, and the forged documents that had driven her to the edge of desperation. But the sight of Phineas Rourke with a Colt revolver pressed under his jaw by Sheriff Dale Cogburn stopped her cold in the sawdust-dusted doorway, the afternoon sun throwing her shadow, long and thin, across the floorboards. "You're going to tell me where those documents are, Rourke," Cogburn snarled, his voice low and oily, his free hand bunching Phineas's collar so hard the man's boots barely skimmed the floor. "Or I'll make sure you never draw another breath in this territory." Every person in the saloon had gone statue, still. The bartender stood frozen with a rag in his hand. A card dealer had his fingers splayed flat on the green felt table. Even the two ranch hands near the window had set down their whiskey glasses and pressed themselves back against the wall, as if making themselves smaller might save them from whatever was about to happen. Violet's hand tightened on the leather satchel she carried. Inside that satchel were the only copies she had of the original deed to her father's ranch, the Hale homestead, 40 acres of prime grazing land that someone had decided was too valuable to leave in the hands of a widow's daughter. She had spent 3 weeks riding from Abilene to reach this dusty little town in the New Mexico territory, the year being 1882, the summer being brutal, and her trust in men being precisely zero. She had heard the name Phineas Rourke long before she arrived. Every town between Abilene and Redemption Creek had a story about him. He had robbed a bank in Tucson. He had shot 3 men in Laredo. He had burned down a judge's courthouse in Santa Fe. The stories layered themselves one on top of another until the name Phineas Rourke became less a man and more a myth, a dark shape on the horizon that every decent person was supposed to fear. Violet Hale did not fear him. She had reserved her fear for something far more practical, the man standing right here in this saloon, pressing a gun under Phineas Rourke's jaw. Because the man holding that gun was the same man whose signature appeared on the forged deed that had stolen her father's land. Sheriff Dale Cogburn. She knew it the instant she saw his face, recognized it from the courthouse records she had pored over in the lamplight of a boarding house 3 nights ago, matching the looping, distinctive capital D in Dale to the looping, identical capital D on every fraudulent document in her satchel. The betrayal of it hit her like cold water. And then something extraordinary happened, something that would unravel every story she had ever heard about Phineas Rourke in the space of a single hour. Phineas Rourke, despite the gun under his jaw, despite the white-knuckled grip of the most corrupt lawman in the New Mexico territory on his collar, looked directly at Violet. Not with the wild, calculating eyes of an outlaw, not with the flat, predatory stare of a dangerous man. He looked at her with recognition, with urgency, with something that looked impossibly like relief. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice remarkably steady for a man one trigger pull from eternity. "I have been waiting for you." Cogburn's eyes snapped to her. His entire face shifted, the lazy cruelty replaced by something sharp and calculating. "Who are you?" he demanded. Violet did not answer him. She was staring at Phineas Rourke, trying to reconcile the stories she had heard with the man in front of her. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and slept light, with dark hair curling slightly at the collar of a worn but clean shirt. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes. His jaw was squared and stubbled. He looked nothing like a monster. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "How do you know my name?" she said quietly. "Because your father wrote to me," Phineas said. 2 months before he died, Benjamin Hale wrote to me and told me everything." The silence in the Lucky Spur Saloon became something almost sacred. Violet's father had been dead for 6 weeks. She had gotten the news by telegraph while she was already on the road, already chasing the trail of lies that had dispossessed her family. She had grieved him in motion, the way frontier women learn to grieve, with dry eyes and a forward direction, and the particular heartbreak that came from having no time to stop. But the sound of his name, Benjamin Hale, spoken by a stranger who claimed to know his secrets, cracked something open in her chest that all 3 weeks of hard riding had not managed to crack. "Get out," Cogburn said to her, his voice returning to that low, oily register. "This does not concern you." "I would advise you to lower that weapon, Sheriff," Violet said, and her voice was so calm that it surprised even her. She reached into her satchel and drew out the folded documents, holding them up where the afternoon light through the saloon's single broad window fell across them. "Because I have copies of the forged deed to the Hale homestead, and your signature is on every page. And I have a federal marshal's telegram in my pocket that says he will arrive in Redemption Creek by Friday to take possession of this evidence." That was a lie. There was no federal marshal. There was no telegram. There was only Violet Hale, 31 days on the road, tired to her marrow, with nothing but her father's papers and her own nerves standing between her and the total destruction of everything he had built. But Cogburn did not know it was a lie. His hand loosened fractionally on Phineas's collar, and in that fraction of a second, Phineas Rourke moved. He was faster than anyone in the room had anticipated, certainly faster than Violet had anticipated, given that he had been suspended half off his feet a moment ago. His elbow drove back into Cogburn's midsection with a crack that folded the sheriff in half. The gun went wide, and Phineas turned and grabbed Cogburn's gun hand at the wrist with both of his and twisted until the revolver clattered to the floor. Cogburn hit the bar with his back and slid down it, gasping. Phineas stepped over the fallen revolver, straightened his collar with one hand, and walked toward Violet with the unhurried stride of a man who had just resolved a minor inconvenience rather than narrowly escaped death. "Thank you," he said, stopping in front of her. Up close, his eyes were an unusual shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain. There was a red mark on his jaw where the gun had pressed. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most reckless. "It was neither," Violet said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It was the only option available." He almost smiled. It was not the smile of a villain or a rogue or a man without conscience. It was the smile of someone who had forgotten briefly what it felt like to have someone in his corner. "We need to talk," he said. "Somewhere Cogburn cannot hear us. And we need to do it quickly, because when he gets his breath back, he will have deputies here inside of 10 minutes. Violet looked at this man, whose reputation she had heard painted in the darkest possible shades. This man her father had apparently trusted with secrets she did not yet know. This man who had just been nearly killed by the exact person she had come to this town to expose. She had promised herself she would never trust a man with a reputation. She had exactly 1 hour to find out whether that promise was something she could afford to keep. They went out the back of the Lucky Spur, through a narrow alley that smelled of horses and dust, and Phineas led her across the back streets of Redemption Creek with the confident knowledge of a man who had mapped every exit from every building in town. Violet kept pace with him, her skirts gathered in one fist, the satchel clutched against her side. Redemption Creek was a town in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. It had the bones of a mining settlement, wide central streets lined with false-fronted buildings, a telegraph office, a general store, a livery, and 3 competing churches, which Violet had always considered a reliable sign of a community that had not yet agreed on its values. The silver deposits in the hills to the east had brought money and ambition, and, as was invariably the case, the kind of men who profited most from other people's ambition. Men like Dale Cogburn. Phineas stopped at a door in the back of what turned out to be the saddle maker's shop, knocked twice, and was admitted by a small, wiry Mexican man with white hair and intelligent eyes who looked at Violet with calm appraisal and stepped back to let them both in. "This is Ernesto," Phineas said. "He is the best saddle maker in the territory and the only person in this town I trust completely." Ernesto nodded to Violet with quiet dignity. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a pair of chairs near his workbench. The shop smelled wonderfully of leather and linseed oil, and it was blessedly cool after the blinding heat outside. Violet sat. She set her satchel on her knees and looked at Phineas Rourke across the small room, and felt the full weight of everything she did not know pressing down on her. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me everything my father wrote to you." Phineas pulled a chair close and sat facing her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and the earnestness of the posture disarmed her more than anything else could have. It was not the posture of a man accustomed to deceiving people. It was the posture of a man about to confess a long-held truth. "Your father and I knew each other 15 years ago," he began. "Before all of it, before the reputation. Before I became whatever name they use for me in the towns you passed through." He paused. "Your father was a good man, Miss Hale. He was the first person who showed me any real decency when I came west at 17 with nothing to my name and more anger than sense. He gave me work on his homestead. He fed me. He talked to me the way a man talks to someone he respects." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I stayed 2 years. Then I moved on the way young men with restless feet do, and I made choices that cost me considerably." "What choices?" Violet asked. "I fell in with men who told me the law was a fiction written by powerful people to protect themselves from the rest of us," Phineas said. "And the bitter thing is they were not entirely wrong, but the conclusion I drew from that truth was catastrophic. I robbed a stage in '73. I was part of a gang for 2 years after that. I told myself it was justice." He exhaled slowly. "It was not justice. It was just crime dressed up in borrowed philosophy." "And the bank in Tucson?" Violet asked. "And the men in Laredo, and the courthouse in Santa Fe." Phineas held her gaze steadily. "The bank in Tucson was a different Rourke entirely, a man named Declan Rourke who has been dead for 4 years. The men in Laredo were a story invented by a cattle baron who wanted my reputation to frighten off settlers. He was trying to run off their land, the same technique, you might notice, that Cogburn is using here. And the courthouse in Santa Fe burned down in a lightning fire during a summer storm in 1879. I was in Colorado at the time. I have sworn testimony to that effect." Violet absorbed this. She did not take it on faith. She filed it, examined it against what she knew, tested its edges for weakness. "You said most of the stories were fabricated," she said carefully. "Not all of them." "No," he agreed. "Not all of them. I rode with a gang for 2 years. I was part of one robbery. When I realized what it actually was, when I saw the family that depended on that stage's cargo, when I understood what I had done to real people rather than to an abstract concept of injustice, I left. I turned myself in to a federal marshal in 1876. I gave testimony against the gang. Most of them went to prison. I served 8 months and was released on the condition that I cooperate with federal investigations into land fraud in the territories." "You are a federal informant," Violet said slowly. "I am an agent of the Justice Department," he said. "Unofficial, unwritten, completely deniable. I have been investigating Dale Cogburn's land fraud scheme for 14 months. Your father found out about it independently because Cogburn made the mistake of targeting a man who had spent his whole life reading the land and knowing his neighbors." Phineas reached into his shirt and withdrew a folded letter. "Your father wrote to me because he remembered me, because he knew the reputation was a fiction, and he knew that meant I might be something other than what people said. He sent me everything he had found. And 2 weeks after he sent this letter, he was dead." Violet's hands were very still in her lap. "The doctor said his heart gave out," she said. "The doctor in Redemption Creek is a man named Ferris," Phineas said quietly. "He signed the death certificate. He also signed 3 other death certificates in the last 2 years for men who had opposed Cogburn's interests." The cold that moved through Violet was not the cool of the saddle shop. It was the cold of understanding arriving all at once, the whole picture assembling itself from fragments she had been carrying separately without knowing they fit together. Her father had not simply died. Her father had been murdered. And the man who had done it was the same man who had just had a gun pressed to Phineas Rourke's jaw. She looked down at the letter in Phineas's hand. "May I read it?" she asked. He held it out to her without hesitation. The handwriting was her father's, unmistakable, the careful, deliberate hand of a man who had learned to write from a schoolbook and treated every letter with the seriousness of someone who understood that written words were permanent. Her eyes moved over it and her throat tightened until breathing became an act of will. Her father had written about the land surveys that did not match, the water rights that had been quietly transferred, the small ranchers who had been pressed off their land one by one. He had written about his suspicions regarding Cogburn, about the intimidation he had experienced when he asked questions at the land office, about the strange visit from Doc Ferris, who had seemed oddly interested in whether Benjamin Hale had shared his concerns with anyone else. And at the end of the letter, in a sentence that broke Violet open entirely, her father had written, "I am telling you this, Phineas, because my daughter is coming. She has her mother's spine and her grandfather's mind, and she will not stop until she finds the truth. Please make sure she has someone she can trust when she gets there. The world is full of men who will disappoint her. You never did." Violet set the letter down on her knee with great care, as if setting down something irreplaceable. "My father trusted you," she said. "Yes," Phineas said. "That does not mean I should." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. Trust has to be earned separately. I understand that." She looked at him for a long moment. This man whose reputation had been constructed from lies and deliberate manipulation. This man her father had believed in despite the stories. This man who had been working against the most powerful, corrupt lawman in the territory for over a year, and apparently had not managed to break anything open yet. "Why haven't you been able to stop Cogburn already?" she asked. "If you have been here 14 months with a Justice Department mandate." "Because I have testimony and observation, but I have not been able to get my hands on the original documents," he said. "The forged deeds, the fraudulent water rights transfers, the original land survey falsifications. Without the physical documents, everything I have is one man's word against a sheriff with a badge and 10 years of institutional authority in this town. The Justice Department will not act without physical evidence." He nodded toward her satchel. "What do you have?" Violet opened the satchel and laid the documents out on the workbench beside them, smoothing each one flat with the back of her hand. There were 7 pages. The forged deed to the Hale homestead, 2 water rights transfers, a land survey dated 1880 that bore the corrections of a careful fraud, the kind of small adjustments to boundary lines that only someone who knew the original land intimately would notice. A bill of sale for mineral rights that her father had never signed but whose falsified signature was close enough to fool a casual observer. Phineas studied them for a long moment without touching them. His expression was the focused, entirely serious expression of a man doing the work he had committed to, and Violet found herself unexpectedly moved by the quality of his attention, by the fact that he was looking at documents that proved her family's devastation with the same gravity with which she herself looked at them. "These are enough," he said at last. "Combined with what I have, this is enough for the Justice Department to act, but Cogburn will know you are here within the hour, if he doesn't already. He will know what you're carrying, and he has 10 deputies who will do whatever he says because he has made them all complicit in his crimes at one level or another." He looked up at her. "We need to get these documents out of Redemption Creek and to a federal marshal before Cogburn can confiscate or destroy them. The nearest federal marshal is in Santa Fe," Violet said, "which is 2 days' hard ride." "Yes, and Cogburn controls every road out of town." "Yes." Violet pressed her lips together and thought. Outside, distantly, she could hear the sounds of Redemption Creek going about its afternoon, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the creak of a wagon, the high voice of a woman calling someone's name. Ordinary life, moving forward with no knowledge of the hidden motive and dark calculation that had been quietly eating away at the honest foundations of this community for years. Cogburn's deputies, she said. Do all of them know the full extent of what he has done? Phineas considered this. Two of them, Marsh and Lindell, are fully aware. They have been with him from the beginning. The others, I believe, know Cogburn runs a rough operation but may not know the depth of it. Who among them has the most to lose if this comes out? Violet asked. Phineas's expression shifted slightly, a look that Violet would later recognize as the particular appreciation he had for people who thought strategically under pressure. A deputy named Calhoun, he said. He has a wife and 2 children. He has been taking a small amount of money from Cogburn, and I believe he knows it is wrong and has been trying to find a way out. He is not a bad man. He is a man who made a desperate choice and has been trapped by it. That, Violet said, is exactly the kind of man we need. Ernesto, who had been listening quietly from his corner, made a small sound that might have been approval. What followed was the kind of planning that Violet had been doing in her head for most of the 3 weeks on the road, the working out of contingencies, the mapping of vulnerabilities, the careful identification of what she could and could not control. She had always had a linear, organized mind, her father's daughter in that respect, and she found that having Phineas to think alongside sharpened everything, because he knew the terrain and she knew the documents, and together they could see the shape of a plan that neither of them would have found alone. They would need 2 things: a way to get a message to Deputy Calhoun without alerting Marsh or Lindell, and a way to get the documents out of town along a route that Cogburn would not immediately think to cover. Ernesto provided both solutions with the quiet efficiency of a man who had lived long enough to know that every crisis had its practical answers if you looked clearly. Calhoun comes to pick up his wife's saddle on Thursdays, Ernesto said. Today is Thursday. He will be here in 1 hour. And as for the route out of town, Ernesto had a nephew, a young man named Miguel who worked as a rider for the mining company, who traveled the Eastern Pass every other day with ore samples for the assay office in Las Cruces. No one stopped the mining company's riders. No one checked their saddlebags. And Miguel was, Ernesto said with a calmness that brooked no argument, entirely trustworthy. Violet looked at Phineas. Phineas looked at Violet. 1 hour, he said. 1 hour, she agreed. The hour that followed was the strangest of Violet Hale's life, and she had lived some extraordinarily strange hours. She had grown up on a frontier homestead, had helped her father birth calves and fight off drought and watch her mother die of fever when Violet was 14. She had ridden to Abilene alone at 22 to apprentice with a land lawyer, had spent 3 years learning the codes and statutes that governed property rights in the territories. She was not a woman who frightened easily or who was susceptible to the kind of romantic foolishness that, in her observation, led intelligent women to make catastrophically unintelligent decisions. But something was happening in that saddle shop in Redemption Creek, in the company of Phineas Rourke, and the quiet, steady presence of Ernesto, and the smell of leather, and the afternoon light coming golden through the single high window, something that Violet could not entirely account for or dismiss. She watched Phineas draft a careful, precise note to Deputy Calhoun, the note touching only on what Calhoun absolutely needed to know and nothing more, protecting the man by limiting his knowledge while giving him enough to make a genuine choice. The care he took with it, the evident consideration for Calhoun's family, the complete absence of coercion in how he framed the request, these things told her things about Phineas Rourke that no reputation, false or true, had prepared her for. "You're not what they said," she said while he was sealing the note. He looked up. "No," he said, "I am not. I am not apologizing for my suspicion," she said firmly. The suspicion was entirely reasonable given the information available. "Of course it was," he said, and there was no defensiveness in it, only a simple acknowledgement that seemed to Violet both mature and rare. "I have spent years being what people believed me to be when it suited a particular purpose. I have never blamed anyone for believing it. I only wished sometimes that there was one person in a given room who might look past the story." "My father did," Violet said. "Your father was exceptional," Phineas said, and the simplicity of the grief in his voice at that moment told her that the loss of Benjamin Hale was real to him, a genuine wound, not a performance. Something softened in her chest. She did not allow it to reach her expression. Not yet. Not when there was still work to be done and danger still very much present. But she felt it, the loosening of a knot she had been carrying for years. The particular knot that came from a decision she had made after a broken engagement at 24, after the man she had believed honorable had proven himself to be precisely the opposite. She had decided then, with the cold clarity of fresh pain, that she would not again trust a man whose standing in the world preceded him, because standing could be manufactured, and reputation could be borrowed, and the only truth was what a person did when it cost them something to do right. Phineas Rourke had been doing right at considerable personal cost for 14 months, in a town full of people who believed him dangerous, without recognition or praise or any form of reward she could see, and he had done it because of a commitment to something larger than himself. She filed that away. She did not act on it, but she filed it. Calhoun arrived at 3:20, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s with a sunburned neck and the careful, slightly haunted eyes of someone carrying a burden too heavy to put down. He read Ernesto's note with his lips pressed together and his hat in his hands, and when he looked up, he looked at Phineas first and then at Violet with an expression that was partly relief and partly terror. "If Cogburn finds out I helped you," he said. "Cogburn will be in federal custody before the week is out," Phineas said. "I give you my word." "Your word," Calhoun said, and there was something complicated in how he said it. "My word, backed by this woman's documents and 14 months of documented investigation that I am delivering to a federal marshal in Santa Fe by Saturday," Phineas said. "Deputy Calhoun, I am not asking you to put yourself in danger. I am asking you to look the other way for 30 minutes while a rider leaves through the Eastern Pass. That is all. You do not need to know the rider's name or what they carry. You are simply not present at the Eastern Road between 4 and 5 o'clock this afternoon." Calhoun turned his hat over in his hands twice. Then he nodded once sharply, and put his hat back on and picked up the saddle Ernesto had brought out for him and walked out the door without another word. Miguel arrived at the back entrance at 3:15, a young man of perhaps 20 with quick eyes and a dependable horse. Violet copied the key documents in Ernesto's careful, cramped handwriting, while Phineas explained the route to Miguel, and they divided the originals and the copies between 2 separate riders to ensure that if one was intercepted, the other would still get through. The plan was that Miguel would take the copies to the federal marshal in Santa Fe. Violet and Phineas would take the originals by a different route, a longer route through the canyon lands to the north that Cogburn's deputies were less likely to know, and meet the marshal at the territorial capital. It was a sensible plan. It was the best available plan. And it required Violet Hale to spend 2 days riding through rough country alone with Phineas Rourke, a man she had known for approximately 1 hour. She looked at the documents laid out on Ernesto's workbench. She looked at the letter from her father, still folded in her hand. She thought about Benjamin Hale writing that letter in the lamplight of his stolen homestead, knowing he was in danger, trusting the one man whose reputation should have made him untrue. She put the documents in her satchel and looked at Phineas. "Do you have horses?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "At the livery on the north side. The owner owes me a favor." "Then let us not waste the hour we have," Violet said. They left Redemption Creek at 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon in the high summer of 1882, riding north through a landscape of arroyos and mesquite and enormous sky, with the stolen future of the Hale family in a satchel on Violet's saddle, and the entire force of a corrupt lawman's fury somewhere behind them. For the first mile, they rode quickly and without conversation. Then the terrain opened somewhat and Violet settled into the rhythm of her horse and let herself think about the practical considerations of the next 48 hours. They had water, enough for the immediate crossing. They had what supplies Ernesto had pressed on them: hard bread, dried meat, a small tin of coffee. The route Phineas had described would take them through the northern canyon country and then drop them southeast toward the Rio Grande Valley, from which Santa Fe was accessible by a well-traveled road. "How well do you know this route?" she asked. "Well enough," he said. "I rode it twice during the investigation. There is a trading post at the canyon mouth, run by a man named Ortega who is honest and will not ask questions. We can rest there tonight if we need to." "We will need to," Violet said practically. "Horses need water and so do people, and riding through the canyon in full dark is inadvisable." "Agreed," he said. The conversation lapsed again, but it was a different quality of silence now, not the tense, watchful silence of two people assessing each other for threat, but something more companionable, the silence of two people who had found they could occupy the same space without friction. After another mile, Phineas said, "How long have you been a land lawyer?" Violet glanced at him sideways. "I never said I was." "Your analysis of the documents was not the analysis of a layperson," he said. "You identified the boundary line falsifications immediately, and you knew which statutes they violated. That is professional knowledge." She found she did not mind being accurately read. "3 years in Abilene," she said. "I read the law under an attorney named Gerald Marsh, a good man and a thorough teacher." "Any relation to Deputy Marsh?" Phineas asked. "Not that I know of." "Why, Cogburn's Deputy Marsh has a brother in Abilene," Phineas said. "I don't know his given name. It is probably nothing." Violet filed this nonetheless. Her mind worked like that, collecting details and holding them in suspension until they found their context. "What will you do," she asked, "when this is over, when Cogburn is in custody and the land fraud is exposed?" The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard, as if he had been so focused on the immediate task for so long that he had not permitted himself to think past it. "I genuinely don't know," he said after a moment. "The Justice Department arrangement was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be specific. This assignment, then another, and another. I have been doing it for 6 years. 6 years of being Phineas Rourke the outlaw in order to investigate actual criminals," she said. "It is a peculiar way to spend one's time," he agreed. "Does it bother you, the reputation?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the horizon the way frontier men watched it, with the automatic vigilance of people who had learned that what appeared on horizons was rarely benign. "It used to bother me considerably," he said. "In the beginning. I wanted to tell every person who looked at me with fear or contempt that they had the story wrong, that I was doing something that mattered, that I was trying to repair some of the damage I had done. But you can't say any of that without compromising the work. So you learn to wear it. You learn to be what they believe you are in the moments it serves you, and you find a way to hold onto who you actually are in the private hours." He paused. "Though I will admit that the private hours have been somewhat scarce recently." "My father saw through it," Violet said. "Your father was paying attention," Phineas said. "Most people see what they expect to see. Your father looked at what was actually in front of him." He glanced at her. "You have some of that quality yourself. You walked into that saloon this afternoon and read the entire situation in approximately 30 seconds. I had context," she said. "I had been studying Cogburn's documents for 3 weeks. I recognized his signature." "Still," he said. The canyon opened before them as the sun began its long western descent, turning the sandstone walls amber and rose and deep, impossible orange. Violet had grown up in the territories, and she had never fully made her peace with the beauty of this landscape, the way it simultaneously diminished you and lifted you up, reminding you that you were small and temporary while also insisting that you were part of something vast and permanent. She thought about her father standing on his land in the early morning, the way he used to when she was a child, watching the light come across the pasture with the expression of a man who could not quite believe his good fortune. He had come west from Ohio with nothing and had built something real and true and lasting, and Cogburn had looked at it and seen only a thing to be taken. "I want the homestead back," she said, not to Phineas exactly, more to the canyon around them. Not just the documents, the actual land, the house, the 40 acres. That is your legal right, Phineas said. The fraudulent deed is void. Once it's established as fraud in federal court, the original deed restores automatically. I know that legally, she said. I meant I want to go back there. I want to actually go back. She had not known she was going to say that until it came out of her. She had been moving toward Redemption Creek for weeks with the focused tunnel vision of someone in crisis, and somewhere behind the crisis was a life she had not yet thought about rebuilding. She was 31 years old. She was a land lawyer without a practice because she had spent 3 weeks on the road. She was her father's daughter, and her father was gone, and the only piece of the world that held his particular weight was 40 acres in the New Mexico territory that someone had stolen, and she intended to reclaim. It is good land, Phineas said quietly. I rode past it once when I was mapping the fraudulent transfers. There is a creek at the northwest corner that runs even in dry years. The pasture grass is the kind that recovers well. Your father maintained it beautifully. Violet looked at him. He was looking at the canyon walls, and the late light fell across his profile in a way that made the strong lines of it look like something a painter would choose. She was not prone to such observations about men, and she noted it with mild annoyance at herself. You sound as though you know it well, she said. I know it the way I know all the land in this case, he said. From the outside, the way you know something that belongs to someone else. He paused. Land like that deserves someone who will live on it properly. I intend to, Violet said. They reached the trading post at the canyon mouth as the last light left the sky, and Ortega, a broad, gray-haired man with a welcoming manner and a genuine lack of curiosity about other people's business, gave them water for the horses and a supper of beans and tortillas and strong coffee, and asked only whether they needed one room or two. Violet said two, without hesitation, and Phineas said nothing, which she appreciated. The rooms were small and clean, with actual mattresses, which was enough to qualify them as luxury after 3 weeks of roadside sleeping. Violet sat on the edge of her bed and laid the satchel in her lap and went through the documents one more time, checking them against her memory of every detail she had assembled on the road, making sure that the chain of evidence was complete, that there were no gaps that Cogburn's defense could exploit. There was a knock at her door at some point after she had blown out the candle and lay in the dark thinking, a quiet knock, 2 taps, clearly Phineas. What is it? She called. Nothing urgent, he said through the door. I only wanted to say, before we sleep, that what you did today took genuine courage. Not recklessness, courage. There is a difference, and you embodied it, and I wanted you to know that someone noticed. Violet lay in the dark and let that settle. Thank you, she said. Footsteps moved away from her door. She lay awake for some time in the particular warmth of the New Mexico desert night, and she thought about her father's letter, about the phrase he had used. The world is full of men who will disappoint her. He had not said she was wrong to be guarded. He had said, implicitly, that being guarded was a rational response to a world that had given her good reason for it. But he had also said, Phineas never disappointed me. The stars outside her single small window were enormous and close in the way they were only in high desert, and Violet thought about trust, about the difference between the naive opening of oneself to danger and the considered, evidenced decision to extend belief to someone who had earned it. She slept better than she had in 31 days. The morning was cool and clear, and she was up before Phineas, which pleased her unreasonably. She had the horses watered and their supplies reorganized, and was drinking coffee at Ortega's outdoor table when Phineas emerged from his room looking slightly rumpled and considerably more approachable than the night before, when every line of him had been drawn tight with the sustained tension of a man who had been in danger for a very long time. He saw her, and the quality of his expression shifted, something that Violet observed with precision and tried not to read too much into. It was the expression of a man who had not expected to find something pleasant waiting for him, and was not sure what to do with the discovery. You are more of a morning person than I expected, he said, accepting the coffee cup Ortega held out to him. "I grew up on a ranch," she said. "The day starts whether you are ready for it or not." He sat down across from her and drank his coffee in the early light, and they discussed the route without urgency, the way people discuss practical matters when the immediate crisis has been survived, and they are not yet sure what the space on the other side of it means. "2 more days to Santa Fe," Phineas said. "The canyon road joins the main trail about 10 miles north. Once we're on the main trail, Cogburn's reach diminishes. He has authority in Redemption Creek and the immediate surrounds, but a federal investigation that is already filed makes him considerably less bold." "Has the investigation been filed?" Violet asked. "My handler in the Justice Department has a full account of everything I've gathered," Phineas said. "He has been waiting for the physical documents to move formally. The moment those copies arrive with Miguel in Santa Fe, he will act. And if something has happened to Miguel, then we arrive with the originals ourselves and the result is the same," Phineas said. "Either way, Cogburn's walls are coming down. It is only a question of how quickly." They rode through the morning in a changing landscape, the canyon country giving way to higher ground covered in pinon and juniper, the air thinning slightly and cooling, a welcome relief from the valley heat. The trail was good, and the horses were steady, and Violet found herself doing something she had not done in a long time, which was simply enjoying being in motion through a beautiful place with no immediate crisis demanding her attention. She found herself talking to Phineas more freely as the miles passed, telling him about Abilene and the law practice, about the particular satisfaction of unraveling a complicated document and finding the truth hidden in its language, about the 3 weeks on the road and the towns she had passed through, and the people who had been willing to talk and the people who had not. He listened with the quality of attention she had noticed in the saddle shop, the focused, genuine attention of someone for whom other people's words were actually interesting. He asked questions that revealed he had been listening carefully. He offered observations that were acute without being overbearing. At one point she was describing the moment she had first identified the forgery in her father's deed, the particular inconsistency in the watermark that had told her the paper was not what it claimed to be, and she looked over at Phineas to find him watching her with an expression that made her trail off mid-sentence. "What?" she said. "You love what you do," he said. "Genuinely love it. Your entire face changes when you talk about the documents." Violet felt warmth move up her neck and was irritated by it. "I find it meaningful," she said. "That is not a lesser thing than love," he said. "Most people spend their lives doing things they find merely tolerable. Finding work that is meaningful is a form of grace." She rode in silence for a moment, recalibrating. The men she had known in her professional life in Abilene had either been indifferent to what she did or faintly condescending about it, the general view being that a woman practicing land law was an interesting curiosity at best and an affront to proper order at worst. She had learned to exist within that condescension without being diminished by it, but she had also, she now realized, quietly accepted the idea that no one would find what she did simply worth admiring. "What did you do," she said, "before the Justice Department, before the gang, when you were young?" "I was going to be a farmer," he said, and the simplicity of it surprised her. "Not a homesteader, not a rancher, a proper farmer. My grandfather had a farm in Pennsylvania. I spent my childhood there learning how wheat grew and what good soil felt like and how to read weather. When he died, the farm passed to an uncle who sold it, and I came west with the money I had and the idea that I would find land of my own." He was quiet for a moment. "I never did. Events intervened." "Do you still want that?" Violet asked. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. "I think," he said carefully, "that what I want has been changing recently." She did not press him on that. But the words stayed with her as they rode, setting beside the image of him in the saloon saying, "I have been waiting for you," beside her father's letter, beside the way he had looked at her over his coffee cup in the morning light. They stopped at noon in the shade of a large juniper, the horses cropping dry grass while they ate and drank water sparingly, and Violet spread the documents on a flat rock to review them one final time in good daylight. Phineas sat beside her, close enough that she could have touched his shoulder without extending her arm, and he watched her work with the same patient, respectful attention he brought to everything. And at some point, Violet became aware that the normal personal distance she maintained had contracted without her consciously choosing it, and that she was not inclined to restore it. She caught him watching her face as she read, and she looked up and held his gaze, and neither of them looked away for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. And in that moment, something was acknowledged between them without words, something neither of them was ready to speak aloud in the middle of a Canyonland noon with felony evidence spread on a rock between them. She looked back at the documents. He looked at the horizon. They ate their dried meat and hard bread without comment and resumed riding. That afternoon they crossed a dry creek bed and startled a pair of wild horses that bolted in a cloud of dust up the canyon wall, and Violet's mare shied so dramatically that Phineas reached out and caught her bridle before Violet had fully registered what was happening, his hand closing over hers on the reins for half a second before both horses settled. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Perfectly fine," she said, which was true in the physical sense and somewhat less true in the immediate sense, because his hand had been warm and steady on hers and she was not accustomed to being steadied. "Skittish mare," he said, releasing her bridle. "She has good reasons to be skittish," Violet said. "She has been ridden very hard for a month. She'll rest well in Santa Fe," he said. "We all will," Violet said. They made camp that night under an open sky, a good 30 miles north of Redemption Creek and well beyond the immediate range of Cogburn's authority. Phineas built a fire with the quiet competence of a man who had made 10,000 camps, and Violet found herself sitting close to it, closer than strictly necessary, watching the flames and thinking about all the things she had been too busy to think about. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said. "I may not answer, but you can ask. Is there anyone who knows who you really are? Anyone besides Ernesto and your Justice Department contact? Anyone who has known you as yourself, not as the reputation, for any length of time?" He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped and settled. Far off something, a coyote probably, lifted a voice against the dark. "No," he said at last. "Not for years. Your father knew briefly, before he died." He looked at the fire. "It is a peculiar thing to go years without anyone knowing your actual name and history. You begin to wonder which one of you is real." "You are real," Violet said. She said it without planning to, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating an observable truth. "Everything I have seen in the past day and a half tells me exactly who you are. You are real." He looked at her across the fire, and in the firelight his face was open in a way it had not been in the daylight, as if the dark and the fire and the distance from the world had made honesty easier. "Violet," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, just her name without the miss, and the sound of it in his voice did something to the center of her chest that she was very much done pretending not to feel. "Yes," she said. "I do not know what happens after Santa Fe," he said. "I don't know if the Justice Department has another assignment or if this particular chapter of my life is over. I don't know a great deal about my own future at the moment." "Neither do I," she said. "I know I want to go home to the Hale homestead. I know I want to practice land law properly, helping people in situations like my father's. I know that I am tired of being alone." She paused. "I did not plan to say that last part." "I am glad you did," he said. They sat for a while longer in the companionable warmth of the fire and the enormous dark, and at some point the distance between them diminished further still. Not dramatically, not in any way that made a statement, but in the quiet, natural way of two people who had stopped pretending that the space between them was neutral ground. When Violet finally lay down to sleep, wrapped in her bedroll with the stars wheeling overhead, she was aware of Phineas a few feet away on the other side of the fire, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the world contained something she was looking forward to. They reached Santa Fe on Saturday afternoon, travel-worn and dust-covered, and somewhat more acquainted with each other than either of them had strictly anticipated. The federal marshal's office was on the main plaza, a solid adobe building with an American flag hanging limp in the afternoon air. Marshal James Alcott was a trim, white-haired man of 60, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades assessing situations for risk. He knew Phineas Rourke, knew his actual situation, and received them both with the brisk efficiency of a man who had been waiting for this particular visit with some impatience. Miguel had arrived the day before. The copies were already in Alcott's possession. He had, he told them, sent a telegraph that morning to the Justice Department and received authorization to arrest Dale Cogburn on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. 2 of his deputies were already on their way to Redemption Creek. And the death of Benjamin Hale? Violet asked, her voice controlled and even. Alcott looked at her directly. The circumstances of Mr. Hale's death will be investigated as part of the overall case, he said. Dr. Farris has been named as a person of interest. If the evidence supports a charge of murder, that charge will be brought. Violet held his gaze. I want to be kept informed, she said. You will be, Alcott said. You are a material witness and the rightful holder of the original deed. You have full standing in this proceeding, Miss Hale. It took 3 hours to give their full statements, to authenticate the documents, to walk Alcott through every step of the chain of evidence that Violet had assembled and that Phineas had been building for 14 months. By the end of it, the sun had set and Violet's hand ached from writing, and there was a deep, satisfied exhaustion in her that felt entirely different from the depleted exhaustion of the road. They walked out of the marshal's office onto the plaza, and the Santa Fe evening was cool and starlit and full of the sounds of a real city, voices and music from the cantinas and the warm smell of cooking from every direction, and Violet stopped walking and simply stood for a moment, letting it settle. It was done, or rather, it was begun. The formal process was in motion. Cogburn would be in custody by Sunday. The Hale homestead would be restored by court order within weeks. Her father's death would be investigated. The truth, the actual truth, would be known. Phineas stood beside her. He had been beside her for 2 days, through canyon country, an open trail, and a federal marshal's office, and she had grown so accustomed to his presence that the idea of the evening without it felt abruptly strange. Will you stay in Santa Fe? She asked. While the case proceeds. Alcott will want me available, he said. So yes, for now. He paused. And you? I will need to be here for the court proceedings, she said. And then I intend to go home. She looked at the plaza, the fountain in the center, the old church at the far end, the lights coming on in the buildings around them. Phineas, she said. Yes. I owe you an acknowledgement. He turned to look at her. I came to Redemption Creek with a fixed idea of who you were, she said. It was an entirely reasonable idea given the available information, but it was wrong. And in the space of approximately 1 hour, the evidence required me to revise it entirely. She met his gaze. I am not embarrassed to have been wrong about you because the process by which I was wrong was sound, but I am very glad that I was wrong. So am I, he said quietly. Violet. They had supper at a place recommended by Alcott, a long table in the back room of a hotel restaurant where they ate real food with real silverware and drank actual wine. And the conversation moved in the easy, curious way of 2 people who had discovered they could talk without effort about nearly anything and were still finding new topics. She told him about her mother, the particular grace of a woman who had come to the frontier underprepared and had grown into its demands with a stubbornness that looked like courage. He told her about Pennsylvania, about his grandfather's farm in the Susquehanna Valley, about the specific smell of wheat at harvest that he had not been able to find again anywhere. She asked about his family. He said there was no one living who knew him, that his parents had died when he was 12 and his grandfather 6 years after that, and that the loneliness of his early life had driven him west toward the imagined community of frontier men, which had turned out to be considerably more complicated than advertised. She told him about the broken engagement, without flinching, because by this point flinching from honesty in front of Phineas Rourke seemed like a waste of both their time. She told him about a man named Thomas Berg who had represented himself as principled and had turned out to be merely calculating, and about the decision she had made afterward, the promise to herself that reputation would no longer be her standard. "And yet," Phineas said. "And yet," she agreed. He looked at her across the table with an expression that she now recognized as the particular expression he wore when he was about to say something that cost him something. She had learned to notice it in 2 days, the slight tightening at the corners of his eyes, the way he drew breath slightly more deliberately. "I want to say something that I have no practical right to say this soon," he said. "I have found," Violet said, "that practicality is often the enemy of honesty." "Then honestly," he said, "I do not want to go back to being Phineas Rourke the myth after this is over. I want to be something smaller and more real. I want land and morning coffee and someone to talk to at the end of the day. I want the farm I never had." He held her gaze. "And I find that when I try to picture any of that, the picture includes you." The stillness of the back room of the hotel restaurant held the moment like cupped hands. Violet thought about her father's letter, about the trust he had extended from the far side of his life to the beginning of hers. She thought about the canyon at sunset and the fire in the desert night, and the 2 days of learning what it felt like to move through a difficult world, alongside someone who was genuinely, structurally, fundamentally on her side. "I'm not a woman who decides quickly," she said. "I was a land lawyer before I was anything else, and I evaluate evidence before I reach conclusions." "I know," he said. "But the evidence," she said, "is considerable." His smile, the full version, was something she had not seen yet. It transformed his face in a way that made everything that had come before look like a preliminary sketch. "I can give you more time," he said. "You can give me the time it takes to resolve this case," she said, "and then we can discuss the rest." "That," he said, "is entirely agreeable." The case took 6 weeks. They were 6 weeks in Santa Fe, in the somewhat unusual arrangement of 2 material witnesses in a federal proceeding who were also something that had no formal name yet. Not courting exactly, not merely colleagues. Something in between that was building with the measured, deliberate pace of 2 people who had both been hurt before, and who valued, above all things, the building of something real. Cogburn was arrested on Sunday as promised. Marshal Alcott's deputies brought him in without significant resistance, the resistance apparently having collapsed at the sight of the warrant, the formal federal warrant with the specific charges laid out in language that left no room for bluster. Marsh and Lindell were arrested the same day. Dr. Ferris, confronted with the evidence regarding the suspicious deaths, broke down and confessed to administering a compound of digitalis in elevated doses that had accelerated the fatal heart episodes of 3 men, including Benjamin Hale. Violet received that information in Alcott's office on a Tuesday morning, and she sat very still with her hands folded in her lap and absorbed it, the formal confirmation of what she had feared, the knowledge that her father had been deliberately murdered by a man who had been paid to protect the health of his community. Phineas was there. He did not speak. He simply placed his hand over hers on the table and kept it there while she made the private internal journey through grief and rage and the particular cold clarity that came on the other side of both. "We have everything we need," she said finally to Alcott. "Make sure it sticks." "It will stick," Alcott said. She stood and Phineas stood with her, and they walked out into the bright Santa Fe morning, and she said nothing for several blocks, and he walked beside her and said nothing, and the quality of that silence was the most profound act of companionship she could remember receiving. When she finally stopped, at the edge of the plaza near the old church, she turned to him and said, "Thank you for being here." "There is nowhere I would rather be," he said. The trial proceedings were swift by the standards of federal justice, the evidence being comprehensive, and the defendants largely incapable of credible denial. Cogburn received a 20-year sentence for fraud, conspiracy, and a charge of accessory to murder. Ferris received 15 years for each of the 3 murders, to be served consecutively. Marsh and Lindell received 8 years each. Calhoun, whose cooperation had been essential and whose crimes had been relatively minor, received a suspended sentence and was released on the condition of full cooperation, which he gave without reservation. The fraudulent deeds were voided by court order in the 4th week. The Hale homestead deed was restored to Violet Hale on a Wednesday afternoon, with very little ceremony but very great significance, the judge simply sliding the document across his bench to her with a nod, as if this were a routine administrative matter rather than the formal restoration of everything her father had built. She held the deed in both hands and felt its weight and thought about Benjamin Hale, about the Ohio boy who had come west with nothing and built 40 acres of real life that now came back to his daughter by operation of law and by the principle that fraud cannot extinguish honest title. "It's yours," Phineas said beside her. "It's mine," she said. "It was always mine." On the last day of the formal proceedings, Alcott pulled Phineas aside for what turned out to be a significant conversation. The Justice Department, Alcott told him, was formally acknowledging his 6 years of service. There was a commendation. There was also an offer of a continued official role, a field position with proper credentials and a salary. Phineas thought about it for the approximate time it took to walk from Alcott's inner office to the outer room where Violet was waiting. He declined. He told Alcott that he had served as long as he intended to serve, that the work had been meaningful but that meaning was not the same as sustainable, and that he had reached the point at which continuing would require the sacrifice of things he was no longer willing to sacrifice. Alcott, who was 60 years old and had made his own accommodations with the cost of the work, received this without argument. "You have earned it," he said, "whatever it is." Phineas walked out of the marshal's office for the last time and found Violet reading on the bench outside, her legs crossed at the ankle, her legal papers spread beside her, the afternoon light bright on her hair. "Well," she said without looking up. "Well," he said, sitting beside her, "I am no longer a Justice Department informant." She looked up at that. How do you feel? He thought about it honestly, the way she had taught him to think about things in 6 weeks of very direct conversation. "I feel," he said, "like a man who has just set down something very heavy and is surprised to find he can stand upright." She smiled. It was not a small smile. "What will you do?" she asked. "That," he said, "depends considerably on what you intend." She closed her legal papers and set them on top of the satchel, the same satchel she had carried into the Lucky Spur Saloon 6 weeks ago with her heart hammering and her nerve fully committed, and she looked at him with the complete, considered attention she gave to everything she took seriously. "I intend to go home," she said, "to the Hale homestead. I intend to establish a proper land law practice in Redemption Creek, because there are a great many people in this territory who need someone who can read documents the way I can, and who has the standing to represent them in court." She paused. "I intend to do all of that, and I find that I want to do it with you." "With me," he said. "With you," she said, "in whatever capacity seems reasonable to both of us. I'm not a woman who rushes, but I am also not a woman who refuses a clear conclusion when the evidence demands it." He took her hand, the one that was resting on top of the satchel, and held it, not tentatively, with the secure, deliberate hold of a man who had made a decision. "Then let me be clear," he said. "I want to marry you. I want to go home to the Hale homestead and build something real with you. I want to farm that land and watch you practice law, and I want to be the man who knows your actual name and you know mine, the real ones, for as long as we both live." He held her gaze. "That is what I want. I am not rushing you, but I wanted you to know precisely where I stand." Violet looked at this man whose reputation had been entirely wrong, whose truth had revealed itself in a single extraordinary hour, and then continued revealing itself across 6 weeks of evidence so consistent and so genuine that refusing it would have been the worst possible misuse of her legal mind. "I am going to need a proper proposal," she said, "when we get back to the homestead. When there is ground under our feet that is actually ours and the light is right and we are not sitting in front of a federal building." His eyes were bright. "That can be arranged," he said. They left Santa Fe on the 1st of September, 1882, traveling south and west, retracing a journey that had begun in crisis and was now ending in something so different from crisis that Violet sometimes had to look backward in her memory to confirm it was the same road. The territory looked different going home, or perhaps she looked at it differently. The arroyos and the mesquite and the enormous sky were the same as they had always been, but she moved through them now with a companion, and the companionship changed the landscape, the way company always changed even familiar rooms, making them larger somehow, more full of possibility. They passed through the place where they had camped on the first night out of Redemption Creek, and the flat rock where Violet had spread the documents was still there, exactly as it had been, unmoved by any of the enormous things that had happened since. "Here," Phineas said, reining his horse to a stop. "Here," Violet said. "This is where you told me I was real," he said. "I would like to mark it in my mind at least as a significant place." Violet looked at the rock and the juniper and the canyon wall turning amber in the early morning light and felt the layered quality of the moment, the way it held both the past and the present simultaneously. "I would too," she said. Redemption Creek received them on a Thursday afternoon, with the particular indifference of a town that had larger concerns than the return of 2 riders from the north. The trial had been widely reported in the territorial newspapers, and there had been considerable public reckoning with the depth and duration of Cogburn's fraud. The discovery that the man who had been their sheriff for 10 years had been systematically stealing the land their neighbors had worked their lives to build. There was a new acting sheriff, a man named Torres who had been appointed by the county on Alcott's recommendation, and Torres was known to be honest, which in Redemption Creek currently carried the weight of a minor miracle. Ernesto came out of his shop when he saw them ride past and stood in the street with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that was the closest he apparently came to joy. "You came back," he said. "We came back," Violet said. He looked at both of them for a moment and then at their hands, which were not touching at this precise moment, but which had the look of hands that did touch regularly, and he made the small sound that was his version of approval. They rode south from Redemption Creek along the creek road to the Hale homestead, and Violet's hands on the reins were steady and her back was straight, and when the property came into view, the house and the barn and the long pasture that ran down to the northwest corner where the creek shone in the afternoon light, she stopped her horse and was very still. The house was occupied, or had been recently. Cogburn had installed a family named Pryor to give the fraud an appearance of legitimacy, and the Pryors had left when the court order came through, taking their belongings but leaving the house in good condition, because the Pryors, it turned out, had been tenants rather than participants, a family that had been told the land was properly purchased and had no knowledge of the fraud. The garden was somewhat neglected. The fence along the north pasture needed work. But the house was standing, the roof was intact, the creek was running, and the grass was the same good grass her father had maintained for 20 years. Violet dismounted without speaking and walked to the middle of the yard, and stood on the ground her father had broken and built and loved, and she thought about him, about Benjamin Hale, who had trusted the right man and who had died before he could see the result of that trust, but whose daughter was here now, standing on his land, holding the deed that proved it was hers. She heard Phineas dismount behind her. He came to stand beside her. He did not speak. He let her have the moment entire. After a long time she said, "We should check the fence line before dark." "Yes," he said. They walked the fence line. It was 4 months into September, and the evenings were cooling rapidly, the light going golden and long the way it did at this latitude in the turning of the year. The northwest corner of the property, where the creek ran, was everything Phineas had said, a reliable line of water in a land where water was the measure of all things, shaded by a row of cottonwoods that had been planted deliberately, her father's long-term thinking made visible in their size. Phineas had been walking the fence line with her, noting where the posts needed reinforcing, where the wire had been allowed to loosen, practical observations delivered in the calm voice of a man who was genuinely interested in the work. At the corner of the property where the creek bent, under the largest cottonwood, he stopped. He turned to her. The light was perfect, because the world sometimes cooperated in this way when you needed it to. The late September sun coming golden and exact through the cottonwood leaves, and laying itself across the creek and the good grass, and the face of the woman who had walked into the Lucky Spur Saloon with documents in her satchel and nerve in her spine and a promise to herself that she was already in the process of reconsidering. "Violet Hale," Phineas said. "Phineas Rourke," she said. "I have been a myth and a fiction and a reputation for long enough," he said. "I want to be a man who has a home and a wife and a real life that belongs to him. I want that life to be here on this land with you." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a ring, simple, a thin gold band set with a small turquoise stone southwestern work, something he had bought from a silversmith in Santa Fe and carried without telling her. "Will you marry me? In the full, considered knowledge of who I actually am, not the story." Violet looked at the ring and then at his face, and then at the creek and the cottonwoods, and the line of the pasture, running to the distant fence, and the whole 40 acres of her father's work and her own future all wrapped together in the late September light. "Yes," she said, "in the full, considered knowledge of who you actually are." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him, and then she stepped forward and kissed him, there under the cottonwood at the northwest corner of the Hale homestead, with the creek running and the light doing everything the light could do. And he held her with the same steadiness with which he held everything, the steadiness of a man who had finally, after a great many years of being lost in the dark, found something worth being still for. They were married in Redemption Creek on a Saturday in October, 6 weeks after arriving home, in the oldest of the 3 churches, the Methodist one on the south end of town that had the best light and a congregation that included, by this point, several families whose land had been restored through the case, and who felt they had a personal stake in the happiness of the woman who had helped make it happen. Ernesto was there, in a suit that fit him exactly as a good suit should fit a man who makes things for a living. Miguel was there, grinning broadly under a good hat. Deputy Calhoun came with his wife and children, and his wife shook Violet's hand with both of hers and said, in a low voice, that she would not forget what had been done. Acting Sheriff Torres brought his family and stood in the back with his hat pressed to his chest. Violet wore her best dress, the dark blue wool one she had packed in the very bottom of her saddlebag 3 weeks before she reached Redemption Creek, some forward-looking instinct having told her that a good dress might eventually be needed. It was not a bride's dress in the conventional sense, being too dark and too practical for that, but she was not a conventional bride and the dress suited her, and the way Phineas looked at her when she walked down the aisle told her that he agreed. The ceremony was short and direct and exact, the kind of ceremony that 2 people of serious mind preferred, no excessive sentiment, only the fundamental promises made in the presence of people who would hold them accountable. When the minister pronounced them married and Phineas kissed her in the Methodist church in Redemption Creek, the small congregation made a sound of collective satisfaction that made Violet think of a puzzle completing itself, all the pieces finally in their right arrangement. The winter that followed was the kind of winter that homesteads required, full of work and cold, and the particular satisfaction of building something from the ground up. Phineas turned out to have, as advertised, a genuine farmer's instinct, the kind of practical knowledge that came from a childhood of paying attention to land. He repaired the fence properly and rebuilt one corner of the barn that had suffered in the previous autumn storms and planted winter wheat in the south pasture, arguing with quiet confidence that the soil composition was right for it, and that the creek-fed moisture would carry it through. He was right about the wheat. Violet established her practice in a room above the general store on the main street of Redemption Creek, which the storekeeper rented to her for a modest sum, having benefited substantially from the post-Cogburn property restorations, and feeling that Violet Hale was the kind of person whose presence in his building reflected well on him. She was busy from the first week. Word had spread through the territory that there was a land lawyer in Redemption Creek who knew what to look for in fraudulent documents, and the families who had been waiting for years, quietly enduring small dispossessions and unfair transfers, began to make appointments. Some of the cases she won easily. Some were more complicated. One case, involving a forged water rights transfer affecting 5 families in the Eastern Valley, took her 3 months and required a trip to Albuquerque to review territorial records, but she won it, and the 5 families in the Eastern Valley had water rights again, and that felt like the work she had been trained for. In the evenings she rode home to the Hale homestead, and Phineas was always there, or on the property somewhere, and the reliable presence of him after the day's work was something she had not known she was missing for the entirety of her adult life. They talked over supper the way she had never been able to talk with anyone else, easily and without performance, about the cases and the wheat and the neighboring families and the state of the territorial government, and the books she was reading and the letters she received from Abilene, and the questions she still had about land law, and the questions he had about farming in this particular soil and climate. He had, it turned out, a gift for reading people that complemented her gift for reading documents, and she found that some of her most complicated professional problems resolved themselves when she described them to him over supper, not because he provided solutions, but because the quality of his listening organized her own thinking. He was, she told him one evening in the first January of their marriage, the best thinking partner she had ever had. "Better than Gerald Marsh?" he asked. "Gerald Marsh had 40 years of experience over me and an exceptional legal mind," she said. "You have a very different set of advantages." "Such as?" "You tell me when I am being stubborn in a way that is not serving the argument," she said. Gerald Marsh was too polite to do that. Phineas considered this. "I will take that as a compliment," he said. "It is the highest compliment I give," she said. In the spring, the wheat came up in the south pasture exactly as Phineas had predicted, and standing at the edge of it on a morning in March, with the new green just showing above the turned earth and the creek glinting in the distance, and the whole enterprise of the homestead feeling genuinely viable for the first time, Violet thought about her father so acutely that it became necessary to stand still and simply allow the grief and the gratitude to exist simultaneously, which was something she was still learning to do. Phineas found her there. He came up behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him, and they stood in the new wheat field for a long time without speaking, which was its own form of language. In the summer, she learned she was expecting their first child. She told Phineas on a Sunday evening, sitting on the porch of the house her father had built, with the territory spread out before them in the long summer light and the creek audible from where they sat. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, something beyond the happiness she was familiar with, something that had the quality of foundations being laid, of a thing becoming permanent. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. He took her hand and held it for a long time without speaking, and she let him have the silence because she understood it, the particular silence of someone receiving a gift too large for immediate words. The child was born in February of 1884, the winter having been cold and long, and the baby arriving, as babies do, with total indifference to the practical preferences of the people waiting for him. He was a boy, healthy and loud, with Phineas's gray-green eyes and Violet's precise frown, and they named him Benjamin, which was not a decision that required any discussion at all. Phineas held Benjamin Rourke on the morning after his birth with the focused, careful attention he brought to all important things, and Violet watched him from the bed and felt the particular fullness of a life that had been constructed from true materials rather than convenient ones. "Hello, Benjamin," Phineas said to the baby, in the same quiet, direct voice he used with everyone he spoke to seriously. "You come from good people. You will be among good people. I give you my word on that." The baby, as newborns do, expressed no opinion on this, but accepted the warmth of being held with every indication of satisfaction. Violet laughed, which she had not expected to do, and Phineas looked up from the baby with the full smile she had been collecting evidence of since the back room of the Santa Fe Hotel, and the morning light came through the window of the Hale homestead, the house her father had built and she had reclaimed, and Benjamin Rourke regarded his first day with the unimpressed serenity of someone who had arrived exactly where he was meant to be. The years unfolded in the way that good years do, with the texture of ordinary days and the occasional landmark that stood out in memory as significant. Violet's legal practice grew and formalized itself, eventually requiring a proper office rather than a rented room, and the building she commissioned in 1885 was built on a lot she had purchased with her own earnings, next to the rebuilt courthouse of Redemption Creek, which now had a judge who was appointed by proper territorial authority rather than installed by a corrupt sheriff. Phineas's farm became genuinely productive in the third year, the wheat and the kitchen garden, and a small herd of cattle that he built with the same patient, methodical care he brought to everything. He became known in the county for his willingness to advise other homesteaders on soil management and rotation, sharing freely what he had learned and what he continued to learn, and the reputation that accumulated around him now, the real one, was so different from the fabricated one that the distance between them could have been the distance between two different men in two different centuries, which, in a sense, it was. In 1886, they had a daughter, Clara, who arrived with Violet's dark hair and Phineas's easy calm, and who from the age of 2 appeared to be determined to understand how everything around her worked, dismantling toys and tools, and once, memorably, the latch mechanism of the barn door with the focused, investigative enthusiasm that Violet recognized as a family trait. Benjamin, by then 3, responded to his sister with a protective seriousness that made Phineas and Violet exchange a look across the breakfast table that contained an entire conversation about inheritance and the quiet miracle of character. The Cogburn case had one final note that arrived in 1886, when Ferris died in the territorial prison of a heart condition that was entirely natural, and Violet received the news with the complex response of someone for whom justice had been served, but for whom nothing would fully compensate for its cost. She sat with it for an evening, and then she let it pass because she had learned, in the years since her father's death, that dwelling in the injustice indefinitely was a way of allowing it to continue taking things from her, and she was not prepared to allow that. She wrote one final letter to the court regarding the matter of her father's murder, a formal, precise letter requesting that the official record acknowledge Benjamin Hale by name as a man who had served his community through his courage and his integrity, and who had died because of it. The court acknowledged the request. The official record was amended. It was a small thing and an insufficient thing, and it was what was available, and she accepted it. She told Phineas about it that evening over supper, and he listened with the same quality of attention he always brought to her, and when she had finished he said, "He would be proud of everything you have built here." "I know," she said. "I feel it." On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, in October of 1887, Phineas surprised her by having Ernesto make her a new saddle, a beautiful one, properly fitted, the leather tooled with a pattern of wildflowers that she would never have requested for herself because she would have considered it an indulgence. It was the most beautiful and most practical thing anyone had ever given her, and she sat in the leather of it on her horse in the early October light and looked out over the homestead, the wheat, the cattle, the house, the garden, the smoke from the kitchen chimney, the line of cottonwoods at the northwest corner where the creek ran, and she felt with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Phineas came and stood beside her horse and looked at the same view. "What do you see?" she asked. "Everything," he said simply. "Everything I ever wanted." The children ran out of the house at that moment. Benjamin taller than she could believe possible for a boy of 4. Clara running after him with the determined stride of someone who intended to keep up regardless of the leg-length differential. And the October light fell on all of them. And Redemption Creek sat in the distance under its enormous sky. And the homestead that Benjamin Hale had built and Violet Hale had reclaimed, and Phineas Rourke had come home to, was alive and working and real. She bent and kissed her husband, there in the yard, in front of the children who made the sounds children make when parents display affection. And he put his hand on her boot in the new saddle and looked up at her with the gray-green eyes that had looked at her across the Lucky Spur Saloon on the first day, and said, without words, what it meant to have been known truly by someone who had chosen to know you. In the spring of 1889, their third child arrived, another boy they named Thomas, not for Violet's former engagement but for no one in particular, simply because the name suited him. Thomas was from the first day a different proposition from his siblings, louder and more demanding, and equipped with a smile of such immediate and disarming charm that Violet suspected he would cause considerable difficulty in his adolescence. Phineas said Thomas reminded him of himself at the same age, which Violet considered both plausible and somewhat alarming in the most affectionate possible way. The New Mexico Territory became the state of New Mexico in 1912, though that event was still decades away from this particular story. And the Hale homestead, by then the Rourke property in the local records, though Violet kept her professional name and the homestead's original designation, would be one of the oldest continuously occupied properties in the county by any measure. But that is the long future, and long futures grow out of particular, specific days. This particular story ends on an ordinary November evening in 1889, with the territory quiet and cold outside, and the house full of the sounds of 3 children and 2 people who had found, against considerable odds, and through the evidence of a single extraordinary hour, that the world could contain exactly the kind of truth that made everything else make sense. Violet was at the table with her legal papers, the case she was building for a family in the Northern Valley, whose water rights had been quietly undermined by a neighboring mining operation. She worked by lamplight the way she had always worked, precisely and without distraction, the documents ordered and the arguments forming themselves in the clear, logical structure her father had given her and Gerald Marsh had refined. Phineas was reading near the fire, one of the agricultural journals that arrived from the East and that he had become genuinely passionate about, the science of soil and water management and crop rotation being, he had discovered, a sufficiently deep subject to occupy a first-rate mind indefinitely. The children were asleep. Or Benjamin was asleep, and Clara was theoretically asleep, but was probably reading under her blanket with a candle she had hidden, which Violet knew about and had decided was a battle not worth fighting given that it was a harmless vice, and one she recognized from her own childhood. Thomas was genuinely, completely, entirely asleep in the way only very young children and very clear consciences managed. The fire crackled. The wind pressed at the window. The lamp was steady. Violet looked up from her papers at some point, for no particular reason, and found Phineas looking at her from his chair by the fire. It was not the first time in 7 years that she had looked up and found him watching her, and it never quite lost its particular quality, the quality of being regarded with absolute attention by someone who found nothing in the world more worth looking at. "What?" she said, which was what she always said. "Nothing," he said, which was never quite true but was always accurate in the sense that what he meant was, everything is right, Everything is as it should be. I am sitting here next to the thing I built my life around, and I am aware of its value in this exact moment. She understood all of that in the single word. She had been understanding it for 7 years. She looked at him across the lamplit room. This man whose reputation had been wrong from the first story to the last. This man her father had trusted, and she had come to trust in the evidence of a single extraordinary hour, and had spent 7 years continuing to verify, correctly and without revision. This man who was the best farmer in the county and the best thinking partner she had ever had and the father of her 3 children, and the occupant of the chair by the fire on every ordinary evening of her life. "I love you," she said, which was not the most lawyerly sentence she had ever spoken but was the most precisely true. "I know," he said, and smiled the full smile. "I love you too." Enormously and without reservation. She went back to her papers. He went back to his journal. The fire held the room. The wind moved over the New Mexico territory. The creek at the northwest corner of the Hale homestead ran in the dark, the way it always did, through dry years and wet, reliable and real, the measure of everything that was worth keeping. The lamp burned steadily until they were both ready to sleep, and then Violet carried it to the bedroom and Phineas checked the fire and the children. And the house on the homestead her father had built held them all in its solid walls. And outside, the stars over New Mexico were the same enormous, extraordinary stars they had always been, indifferent to human dramas and human truths both, but present for all of it nonetheless. This was the life of Violet Hale and Phineas Rourke, built from the evidence of 1 hour and the accumulated proof of every day that followed. Real, exact, and fully theirs.